We want to tell the MS community that we're in the fight for advancement in MS together. And the ongoing clinical trials are crucial for us, but they're also, I think, supported by the MS community. We have a lot of good interactions with patients advocates, and they're very interested in what we do.
Hello, you're watching Proactive. Joining me is Immunic Therapeutics Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Andreas Müller. Andreas, very good to speak with you. MS Awareness Month coming to an end, and throughout March, advocacy groups, patients, experts, researchers, all working to bring attention to the challenges of living with MS. Why is raising awareness so important, and how does it impact research and treatment development?
Yeah, hi, Stephen. Good to talk to you again. And yes, it's a tradition in the MS community that we celebrate March as the MS Awareness Month. And I think it's still very appropriate. MS is a disease with 1,000 faces that can start with very different symptoms for patients. And to really make sure that there's always the thought that this could be the early symptoms of MS, I think is important. I think for patients that have symptoms but are not diagnosed yet. It's known that an MS it sometimes takes a while to really get the diagnosis because they're so unspecific. However, also for those patients who have MS and suffer from MS, I think this is a very important month because there is a strong sense of community with MS patients, and that's good because the MS community actually has achieved a lot over the last 2 or 3 decades in terms of advances of treatments, making sure there's more awareness that they're really thought of in terms of funding. This is a time, especially in the US, where I think research funding is on everybody's mind because I think a lot of the advances in the MS treatment came out of academic research initially or NIH supported research. So I think we all hope that this is a month also where we remind, I think, the general public that this is quite important. This basic research funding will lead to therapies down the road and to new advancements. And I think that's this year. I think, and I spoke at some of the scientific medical meetings with basically members of these advocacy groups, and they're quite concerned that is not yet fully understood. So this is the year, I think, to remind people that funding in basic research is necessary to fund new advances in MS. So this is probably the months also to talk about that.
And Andreas, your lead asset, vidofludimus calcium, has shown promising results in clinical MS trials already. Can you share the latest developments and what they mean for patients?
Absolutely. I think we are really proud of having developed some very good clinical data already in both relapsing as well as progressive MS. And this is something that really is characteristic for our lead asset, vidofludimus calcium. So we had initially started with a phase 2 trial in relapsing remitting MS. And phase 2 trial is usually the first trial that you do really in patients, where you look at not only whether the drug really has an effect in this population of patients, but also which dose you should use and also what the side effect profile is in these patients. So for all of these areas, we found very good results from these phase 2 trials. We call it EMPhASIS trial. We had shown that the drug had a very strong effect on suppressing new MRI lesions. Basically, about 3/4 of MRI lesions disappear with the treatment as compared to a placebo group. That's a very good value. And MRI lesions usually also are connected to disease activity in relapsing MS patients. So this is a very good start. But we also showed that in terms of biomarkers, neurofilament, we had a very strong linear suppression of this biomarker, which is related to destruction of neurons, of nerve cells. And this really led us to start a phase 3 trial in relapsing MS, which is ongoing, our ENSURE 1 and 2 trials, identical trials. We are quite far along in this phase 3. We plan a readout in 2026. Which means I think we must be very much at the end. We are on track for that, and we're very proud that as a biotech company, we were able to really pull off this large program, because will be more than 2,000 patients enrolled in these 2 trials, which allows us then to really talk about the submission of regulatory approval. So we're relatively, in drug development terms, we're relatively close to be able to file for approval. And then also, I think there's a high unmet medical need, of course, in progressive MS, because there's very few treatments available, if any, for some of the subpopulations in progressive MS. And we started a relatively large phase 2 trial, which we call Caliper. And this trial had some interim data that we read out. This was based on biomarkers, on neurofilament light chain, NFL, usually called, and then GFAP, another blood biomarker. And both of them, we really saw a good signal in this interim analysis for data up to 24 weeks of treatment versus placebo. So we have very high expectations now for seeing that this biomarker response also converts into a clinical response. And we're very close to readout of this trial, which is basically within the next weeks. And so we are very much waiting for the readout of this trial, which will be wonderful if this shows an advance for progressive MS patients as well.
Andreas, MS patients, whether diagnosed with relapsing MS or progressive MS, often share the same fear, and that's disability progression and the possibility of eventually needing a wheelchair. How is Immunic working to address this major concern?
I agree, and I think should be the discussion when you talk to patients or patient advocates. I think it's very clear that if you get the diagnosis, and that's, I think, very appropriate to talk about this in the MS Awareness Month, is they really have the fear of being in a wheelchair in the future, not being mobile, not being active, and not being able to really, I think, support your own lifestyle in the same way that they can do it now. So, and you're diagnosed relatively early in life, so the 20s and 30s usually, in most cases. So I think this is a worry. And we also learned a little bit more about what's behind MS. Usually in most of the patients, 85 and 90% of patients, the disease is initially characterized by relapses. So you suddenly get worse and then you recover. But we learned over the last years that there is another process running in the background. We call it now smoldering disease, for lack of better words, that is like a slowly worsening disability. And it's not yet fully, I think there's a lot of ideas about it, but not yet fully understood what really causes this, but that really overlays, I think, the relapses. And we were extremely good now in preventing relapses. I think we learned also with the data that was published over the last years that the prevention of disability that's not connected to relapses, what's the scientific community calls PIRA, is something that's not yet well addressed by treatment. So I think this is something that I think the whole scientific medical community, but also the MS community, patient community, understands that there must be progress in terms of addressing disability that's independent of these relapses. And this is something that is really on everybody's mind. And we learned also that in early MS, even in early MS, the disability that's not connected to relapses could be about 50% of the disability worsening. In progression, it becomes much more. So this is one of the unsolved issues. So we have a lot of treatments, of course, for MS, but I think they're focusing on relapses rather than the disability in most cases. And so I think this is something that the MS community wants to have addressed by companies like us, but also by ongoing basic research more than that was done in the past.
Andreas, what message would you like to share with MS patients and their families as MS Awareness Month draws to a close?
I think, first of all, I think as a biotech company, of course, we have to say that we are highly appreciative of their willingness to go into trials, to support clinical research. I think that's very important to us. And I've done in my professional life, I've done a lot of clinical trials and other indications as well. And MS is one of those indications. You know how motivated MS patients are. They will want to support research. They want to have advancement. I think we have to thank them and their families, I think, for having this focus and supporting, I think, our clinical research and other clinical research as well. We as a company, we are committed to them. We are committed to advancement in MS treatments. We feel that with the different mechanisms of action that vidofludimus calcium have, we have two separate and independent mechanisms of action. One is, of course, a more anti-inflammatory, antiviral effect, which is in line, I think, with existing treatments, more or less. But then we also have a second mechanism of action that's more a neuroprotective effect that's independent of relapses. And we do think that this could address the whole spectrum of MS, and maybe the first oral drug that can really address the full spectrum of MS. So I think for us, I think we want to give them a message. We're very committed to advancement. We're very committed to addressing the unsolved issue of disability worsening, and do this in a way that we also make sure that this is a drug that's very well tolerated, that patients have the feeling that they continue their life without a daily reminder of having adverse events from their treatment. So we want to tell the MS community that we're in the fight for advancement in MS together, and the ongoing clinical trials are crucial for us, but they're also, I think, supported by the MS community. We have a lot of good interactions with patients advocates, and they're very interested in what we do. And we very much appreciate that we have that very collaborative relationship with patient advocates and with patients in general and with our investigators.
Andreas, thank you very much, as always, for your insights. It was good speaking with you today.
Thank you, Steve. Good to talk to you.